My name is Randall Eby and I'm super excited to be a part of this with you today. Today we're going to be covering the troubleshooting topic of E82D error code, and it's specifically related to the Evolution Elite gas fryer we have here beside me. So let's go ahead and jump into the tools and the parts that we're going to need to take with us to the job site. I have a flashlight powered screw gun, 6-in-1 screwdriver, a wider tipped flat bladed screwdriver, large and smaller adjustable wrenches, an 1/8 of an inch Allen wrench or hex key, multimeter, properly calibrated inch-pound torque wrench, blue Loctite. This brings us to some of the parts that we're going to need. The AIF board, part number 85698, encoder motor assembly. It's going to be a part number 168686. When we talk about the logic behind that error code, the E82D, what it's seeing is when we come into the store, anytime we turn this main power switch on, it's going to do its calibration for the encoder motor. What that's going to do is it's going to send our 24 volts DC out to the encoder motor. It's going to do 2 revolutions, and then it's going to give that feedback to the AIF board. If the AIF board does not see what it's looking for, then this is where it communicates with the control panel and can generate the E82D error code. And what it's looking for is for that the encoder motor to be at that home port and counting all those sensors within that revolution. So with that being said, I like to break this down into 3 scenarios that we can run into in the field with this specific error code. So if I'm a technician going into the store and I simply turn this unit on with the main power switch and I hear that encoder motor turning like we just did, I know where I can take my troubleshooting. I know for a fact that I'm getting my 24 volts DC going to that encoder motor, so I can break it down to this point now. Most likely we have a communication problem between the encoder motor and the AIF board. Now, which one is it is the question. Now what we see most likely is causing the problem is the encoder motor itself. Now the reason being is because there's roughly 2,000 encoder sensors inside that encoder motor itself, checking for all those. So usually what we see is it's not delivering that feedback back to the AIF board. If our motor is turning when we turn this on and we can hear it, we know our voltage is there, but we're still constantly getting the E82D error code, then this is where we would want to start with replacing that encoder motor. In very rare situations is it actually going to be the AIF board, but we can't rule that out. So let's talk about the other situation. Let's say we come into the store, we turn our main power switch on, and we don't hear anything. Well, this is where we need to be ready to get our multimeter out and do some additional troubleshooting. But before we do, the most important thing is we want to make sure that we power this main power switch down before we start unplugging or plugging anything in related to the control board or the AIF board, as this can easily damage components on any one of those boards, as the electronics can be sensitive to that kind of activity. So let's go ahead and go over here to our next stage and we'll do some troubleshooting. Anytime we're doing a check on checking for our DC voltage coming out of this connector right here, we want to make sure that this 6-pin plug is plugged in. Now, the reason being is because you can see on this plug it has this jumper wire right here. If this AIF board does not see this jumper wire, you will never get your voltage coming out of these pins here, your 24 volts DC for your encoder motor. And the reason being is if it doesn't see this jumper wire right here, this AIF board thinks it's a solenoid valve setup. So it's critical that when we're doing our check that we have that plugged in and we check it here. Because if we were to have this unplugged and try and check our voltage here, we'll never get it. We're going to go ahead and unplug this 2-pin connector, which is our supply voltage for our encoder motor. We're looking for 24 volts DC there, coming straight off of our AIF board. Plug in our probes, turn our meter to DC voltage, and then we go ahead and power this unit up. We can be looking for our 24 volts DC. It's not uncommon to see that 26 to 27 volts DC. So if we have our voltage here, but we don't hear that encoder motor coming on when it's plugged back in, then we know for a fact that we have a bad encoder motor assembly. I want to emphasize the importance with intermittent issues with this E82D error code that we do our due diligence as technicians to make the checks that we need to. And when we talk about the checks, we know that what's involved with this error code, with the logic behind it, and its circuitry. We know that the AIF board plays a component. We know that the communication cable coming back from the encoder motor plays a part, our supply voltage. So it's important that we check all these connections with the unit powered down. And when I say check them, I actually mean unplugging them and plugging them back in so that we can clean all these contact points. And what that does is that allows us to get a better connection to hopefully minimize the chance of that E82D error code coming back up again. When we're talking about intermittent issues with an E82D, if we have any oil residue whatsoever when we separate these two components, either inside this cavity or housing or on top of this selector valve body, this would end up causing an intermittent issue with the E82D, especially if that oil is to get on the encoder assembly here. Now, if us as a technician, if we're in the field and we see that this unit has indications of oil leakage, which would be from this seal here, which unfortunately is not replaceable, it's not a serviceable seal, what you're going to need to do is you're going to need to go ahead and call into tech support, go ahead, take a couple pictures and send them to them, and then they will review it and give you approval to replace this entire assembly. Because if we have oil residue in here or in here, replacing the encoder motor is going to be a very temporary solution.